My attitude on all this is I don't believe it. Don't know, don't care. I just don't believe it.
The reason why is because he's scared. He is afraid. This is happening too often, and Tim Pool doesn't like it. But he understands, I believe, that this could be the potential consequence of such vitriolic commentary, especially when it comes to his commentary on queer people, like these two tweets. And these aren't the only one. He's just going, na 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 boo boo, I don't hear it, because that's easier than owning up to the fact that this is likely to be a problem that you could fix as Tim Pool, but then you might start losing money because you wouldn't be able to peddle a lot of this that gets a lot of clicks, that gets a lot of views and ad revenue. Or maybe he's genuinely interested in these things happening and, you know, he derives some kind of sick pleasure from it. Who knows? But what we do know is that he has to have some level of understanding of the potential for this happening, given how many times he's being seen in the watch history of a variety of these violent right-wing attackers, that he now has to try to, like, hide from that and ignore that inconvenient truth. So he just doesn't believe it, you know? Just don't believe it, man. So once again, the totally predictable has happened, the historical precedent for which anybody could have called happening at any point in time. Turns out that another right-winger who decided to do a politically motivated attack on another human being has been federally convicted of said attack. We're, of course, talking about David depape, who ended up attacking Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, with a hammer. Now, of course, when that first happened, on the right, in terms of the media figures in response to the event, was a mixture of calling him based and also calling him a left-wing Antifa op. But now it turns out that when he testified on the stand, on trial, which he was eventually convicted of for federal charges, he ended up saying that he was, in fact, inspired to commit that attack because of a variety of right-wing commentators that he had been watching online that kind of put these ideas into his head. From PBS, from November 14, 2023, it's a week and some ago, the man accused of attacking former U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband with a hammer last year told jurors at his federal trial Tuesday how he went to the Pelosi's San Francisco home as part of a bigger plan to end corruption in the United States. David depape spoke for more than an hour in which he tearfully recounted about how his political leanings went from leftist to right-wing after reading a comment on a YouTube video about former President Donald Trump. This is how you know he was not a quote-unquote leftist, by the way. If all it takes for you to switch from, like, far left to right-wing is reading a comment on a YouTube video, you had no actual, like, strong foundational political thoughts on anything. Like, your ideology was already up in the air. But, I mean, do what you will. You can throw a little bit of shade at the left if you want. But this is not our L to take, as we're about to read. After reading a comment on a YouTube video about former President Donald Trump, he did not deny bludgeoning Paul Pelosi, saying he reacted after realizing his larger plan might be unraveling. Testimony wrapped up later Tuesday with closing arguments expected Wednesday. depape has pleaded not guilty to attempted kidnapping of a federal official and assault on the immediate family member of a federal official, with intent to retaliate against the official for performance of their duties. His attorneys argue that he was not seeking to go after Nancy Pelosi because of her official duties as a member of Congress, and so the charges do not fit. That defense, by the way, did not end up working out. He has since been convicted of those federal charges. This is an older article, but we're looking at it because a certain beanied individual has decided to look at this article as well and has some problems with it. So we'll look at that in a second. So it turns out it was actually two articles, both of which he hasn't really read. But here we get a bit of information about depape's motives, depape. Originally from Canada, they're not sending their best folks. depape said he was doing carpentry and living in a friend's garage in Richmond at the time of the attack, using bathrooms at parks or restaurants. He testified that he spent endless hours playing video games as well as watching and listening to political content online. The video game angle, man. I've played countless hours of video games, and I'm not out here bludgeoning the spouses of one of the most powerful politicians in the country about it, okay? depape said he mainly watched YouTube videos and listened to podcasts from the likes of Tim Pool, Glenn Beck, and conservative media outlets. He described his worldview as taking up a battle against a sinister cabal of government officials, celebrities, and pedophiles driving the country to ruin, echoing baseless QAnon diatribes. So, like, we can throw up the shocked Pikachu face right now. This is not shocking at all. Tim Pool has been a popular watch from other violent attackers in the past. It's incredibly common at this point that a variety of right-wing commentators online are being implicated in terms of these people's manifestos and internet history for people who end up going and doing violent attacks and domestic extremism and terrorism, right? So it's likely that this right-wing lunatic probably listened to a variety of these people. You'll notice that this doesn't often happen for left-wing commentators because there isn't as much of an absolute fucking frothing, violent urge inlaid within a lot of left-wing commentators' commentary, videos, podcasts, etc. Mostly because there is a variety of other reasons as to why right-wingers tend to be more violent and why they are overrepresented in rates of domestic extremism in the United States to the tune of like exponential numbers comparatively to left-wing perpetrators of domestic extremism. And we will get into that. But Tim Pool has some problems with being cited in this article here. So let's see what's up.
The man who attacked Paul Pelosi last year has testified that it was right-wing conspiracies driven by Gamergate that resulted in his plot to break into the Pelosi's home and to prove corruption. You see, his plan was
Why does this man talk like this? Like, I know I put on a bit of a segment voice, a YouTube voice, every now and again, but like, these enunciations, man.
He wanted to kidnap Nancy Pelosi, force her to confess to corruption on camera, and post it on the internet.
Yeah, that's what
he said he wanted to send a message.
That's what he said in the testimony, in the trial that he has since been federally convicted of the charges in.
Members of Congress that there are consequences for corruption. It's rather insane, if you ask me. But we're all big fans of the mainstream media, so let me just say, Paul Pelosi, who was accused of trying to buy drugs from a man in San Francisco in a deal that went wrong, was, you get the point.
Relevance? Paul Pelosi, who was accused of drinking warm milk too early before going to sleep and ended up pissing himself in his bed, like, what is the relevance here, man? Like, I think this was part of the conspiracy that right-wingers were crafting once they realized that it did not look good, that a right-wing guy, David depape, ended up attacking the husband of one of the most powerful Democrats in the country. Once they realized that that wasn't really good optics, they ended up crafting a conspiracy theory about how, like, he was there because depape was Paul Pelosi's gay lover, which is a really funny conspiracy theory, but I don't think has ended up being true. Maybe not enough investigation has been done into the sexual proclivities of the Pelosis. I know the right-wingers like to talk about, Nancy Pelosi's sexual exploits a lot. They think about it pretty frequently. Gilf hunters, potentially, in their ranks. But I guess there's also now a conspiracy theory that depape was his drug dealer or something, and that's why he was in the house. Even though he has testified, at the time Tim Pool is recording this, he has testified that he was in fact there because he broke into the house with the intent to kidnap Nancy Pelosi and attack Paul Pelosi with a hammer because Nancy Pelosi was not there, even though he thought he was going to be. And this was in a federal trial. The accusations he has since been convicted of federally. So, like, unless he was lying on the stand, you would think he would be doing that to get out of the charges, but this wouldn't be the way you would do it, right? Like, if you're lying on the stand to get out of the charges, you wouldn't be like, yeah, the lie here is that I was actually going there to kidnap Pelosi to have her answer for her corruption. And Paul Pelosi ended up being there, so I just hit him with a hammer. Like, that wouldn't be your lie to get out of the charges. The lie would likely be, oh, I was Paul Pelosi's gay lover, and that's why I was there, actually. And it was a lover's quarrel gone wrong, right? Or, yeah, I was this drug dealer, actually, because those would be smaller crimes with smaller charges, and you would be able to kind of, hopefully, maybe, get out of that federal charge, right? That's the way you would lie about it. So, like, why would he not do that? Why would depape be lying in this instance, which is obviously what Tim Pool is insinuating? If he thinks, like, oh, the media is, talking about how he's accused of, buying drugs or wanting to, and that guy who was going to sell the drugs was depape, and that's why he was in the house, it doesn't make sense, man. Like, unless depape is as stupid as Tim Pool is, which is possible, I don't get it.
Yes, Paul Pelosi was accused of doing such a thing. There's no strong evidence for it. Just, I don't know, circumstance and people wondering why it is that this guy was able to get into his house. There was no security detail, and the story doesn't really add up. And now, quite conveniently...
Believe me, folks, quite conveniently. Are you doing a Donald Trump there? Yeah, no, so he is talking about the conspiracy theory here. So the thing is here is that Nancy Pelosi wasn't home, obviously, at the time, which is why Paul Pelosi got bonked. Because depape would have been bonking Nancy Pelosi if she was. That's what he testified on the stand, that he was going to kidnap Nancy Pelosi. Those were his words in his federal trial where he was convicted. So Nancy Pelosi wasn't home. Why would her security detail be there? Her security detail is probably where she is, which is not at home. And I don't believe it is common practice to have security detail for the immediate and extended family of powerful politicians, unless they have a credible threat of violence against them, right? or they're paying like private security, which I don't believe there is any evidence of. And clearly there was no security at the time because it was just Paul Pelosi at home. Like, politicians have been assaulted out and about with their security there. So it's not even to say that that would have stopped them. But obviously it's an impediment, and that's, the hope that it would. But like, why would family members be getting the same treatment? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. Like, I can see where you would think that. I can see where you'd be like, oh yeah, well, of course, the immediate family of this powerful politician would likely have, government security detail with them, but evidently not. Like, he just has like a live-in security team, like fucking Gustavo from Breaking Bad.
And the story doesn't really add up. And now, quite conveniently, what the media is reporting is that DePape went on the stand and said James Lindsay, Glenn Beck, and Tim Pool.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
That he was watching these podcasts and then got angry about corruption. But you know what?
So you know what's happening here is that anybody with 2 brain cells to make pretend kiss in their brain could probably put 2 and 2 together and be like, wow, these right-wingers are often talking about a lot of violent shit. They're often making excuses for a lot of violent shit. They're also making accusations that are often false and have no actual foundation in reality of violent intent or acts done by their political opposition. They're so frequently doing this, talking about this stuff, and making excuses for and playing defense for the people that then go out and do these things, like they did with the Colorado Springs shooter, that it is not shocking that those people who end up going out and committing those attacks for politically motivated reasons would have been fans of your show, Tim Pool, or Glenn Beck, or James Lindsay, or Matt Walsh, or Ben Shapiro. Because 1, the logic there makes sense, and 2, we have literal historical precedent of convictions of violent offenders who have either had their internet history been flooded with media from these commentators, or have directly cited them in their manifestos. It's just logic at that point. It's just probability at that point. And like, this is something that all public figures have to worry about. Even like regular normie-ass celebrities have to worry about how their words are going to be interpreted by their fans. They have to worry about the parasocial aspects of what they do, potentially making people more or less likely to go and do something. If you have a fair amount of influence in a space like this, like Tim Pool does, with his 1.21 million subscribers on this channel, or he has other ones that I believe have similar subscriber counts, you have to understand that by its very nature, being a content creator, especially in the new media space, brings with it the risk of people taking your words out of context and then using what they thought you meant or directly what you meant to do whatever it is they end up doing. And that can't only be negative. Like, if you talk about how it's a good idea to bathe regularly, and a person who's listening to you doesn't bathe regularly, like maybe they're a Tim Pool viewer, but you talk about how bathing regularly is cool, and you influence them to do that because of that, that you're helping that person out. That's W in my book. But you can also be talking about how, like, oh, it's Civil War. Civil War's coming, guys. Civil War is just around the corner. Civil War, is this the Civil War? This is going to be the start of the Civil War. Civil Wars, like Tim Pool does, which if you didn't know, Civil Wars, wars generally tend to be violent. I'm not sure if we forgot about that in our many years as a country in the United States of America, where Tim Pool is also from, and the politics of which he's talking about. This country, we're not usually engaging in warfare, throughout our history. Certainly, there's no historical precedent for that. Wars are actually pretty violent, it would turn out. So if you keep fear-mongering about a potential civil war happening, you cannot be shocked when violent people end up watching your show, or people with violent intent, or people with the potential for violent intent who end up getting turned on, like a switch flicks in their head, and they're like, okay, yeah, maybe I will go out and do XYZ violent, terrible thing because of what I'm hearing on these programs. Especially if you're going to smear literally every single LGBTQ plus person and their allies as PDF files, as child abusers, with no evidence. And in fact, there is more evidence to paint a broad brush about the perpetrators of said crimes being right-wing. Like, you cannot do this and then not expect somebody to take that information and try to fix it in any way that they think they can. Because there's going to be, in any audience, there are going to be people who are not fully mentally there, right? There's always the possibility of that. And I would say the possibility of that being the case in Tim Pool's audience is very high. Because if you're regularly watching Tim Pool, you might want to go and get an evaluation by a professional, is all I'm going to say. Because it takes a certain mind to get to that point, to stoop so low, to fall to such depths, that you're regularly tuning into the Timcast broadcast to get your news and information. But like, we don't even have to take my words for it. I'm just now remembering this tweet because I talked about how the right wing was playing defense for the Colorado Springs shooter who shot up that queer club. From Timcast, the grooming. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. What is the November 22nd, 8 a.m., 9 a.m.? So this was after the Colorado Springs shooting, where a person who pretended to be non-binary, by the way, we found out that, after that guy made the bogus claim that he used they, them pronouns, which doesn't really mean anything anyway, but of course right-wingers were being like, oh, well, if the Colorado Springs shooter's non-binary, that means literally every single queer person is a potential mass shooter because they're stupid. But he ended up using he, him pronouns, and his lawyer ended up using he, him pronouns, and it was literally just a gambit to try to get out of hate crime charges that I believe he was eventually convicted of for shooting up a queer bar. So that happened, and then this is one of Tim Pool's immediate thoughts on the matter. He says, and I quote, "The grooming of children is not stopping. People are calling for more violence." Who people are calling for more violence? Who knows? Who's calling people groomers with no evidence all the time? Who knows? I do not think legislators will stop the grooming. Okay, so there's no legal method of dealing with this supposed problem. People will not stop calling for violence. Who these people? It's kind of shady. Who could it possibly be? So you tell me what happens next, which is essentially saying that, they're bringing it upon themselves. Even though there is no evidence for queer people being predisposed to, grooming, and in fact there is more evidence, a treasure trove of evidence, that right-wingers tend to be more likely to play defense for, support, or commit grooming and child abuse. Like, you're literally making excuses for violence. You're doing it in a very weaselly and cowardly way instead of just saying it with your chest and being like, oh, well, this is the logic of the situation and it would logically follow. But you can't really make logic-based statements on something that isn't happening, right? Like, one of the pivotal points of this line of thinking, this logic tree, is that there is this whole bunch of grooming going on, and we can infer that he means from queer people who are doing it, because 1, he has said that multiple times, 2, he has used the words groomer and queer interchangeably, and 3, this is after a person shot up a queer bar in a hate attack and killed a variety of people. You can kind of infer that he's talking about queer people when he's talking about the grooming of children, especially considering he doesn't often talk about, say, the Catholic Church. He doesn't often talk about, the fact that elected Republicans seem to have a history of being convicted of said crimes. Not often talking about that stuff, but he will always talk about it in reference to queer people. So then he goes on to say, 10 minutes after, 9 minutes even, Kurt Schlichter, "I don't think we have to tolerate PDF files because some asshole shot up a gay bar. Frankly, a lot of people trying to convince us we need to tolerate PDF files seem to be happy to use any excuse to silence our opposition. Stupid ass motherfucker." So then Tim Pool quote tweets this and replies, "We shouldn't tolerate PDF files grooming kids. Club Q had a grooming event. Oh, so the mask slips. How do prevent the violence and stop the grooming?" So he says Club Q had a grooming event, which is the club that was shot up by that person who was convicted of hate crime charges, I believe. It was not a grooming event. It was just another night at this queer bar. I believe there was a drag show, but it was not a family-friendly one. It was like a night show. I don't even know if there was anything explicit going on there. Obviously, if there is, children shouldn't be present, and usually venues will make it clear that this is an adult-only show, like if alcohol is being served and all this kind of shit. So the idea that there was a so-called grooming event is based only on the fact that Tim Pool wants to smear all queer people as threats to children in whatever capacity, with no evidence. No actual data to back it up, just pure speculation and smears, essentially. So when he says, how do we prevent the violence and stop the grooming? And then you go back to this previous tweet 9 minutes earlier, and when he says he, Tim Pool, so before here, he's talking in the abstract. He's talking like, in bird's eye view. But then he makes a statement from his own mouth, in a rare instance of not being totally cowardly, and he says, "I do not think legislators will stop the grooming," meaning that there is no legislative or legal way to stop the so-called grooming that he thinks is happening from, in this instance, queer people. He says people will not stop calling for violence, so you tell me what happens next, which he's insinuating is violence, which now he's making an excuse for the Club Q shooter doing what he did. And in this tweet now, how do we prevent the violence and stop the grooming if he doesn't think legislators will stop it? He doesn't think there's a way. So he's okay with the violence in this instance? Like, now the question is Tim Pool okay with the violence so long as there is no other option to stop this problem that doesn't actually exist? Because if that is the case, and it certainly seems to be that way, given his own words, it seems like he's not actually against the violence. He also doesn't condemn the violence at all in any of these tweets. The right wing was bloodthirsty about this shooting happening and weren't even like doing thoughts and prayers shit as much as they used to. They weren't really disavowing the guy too much. You even saw this recent one, divorced from queer issues, of that dude who shot and killed two protesters who blocked a street, his ability to go through it in his car. He shot and killed those two climate protesters in cold blood because they were blocking the road. And they're playing defense for that guy too and making dumbass posts like, this isn't anger, this is fatigue. He's not angry, he's tired. Which is just a way of being like, yeah, well, it's gonna happen. That violence is gonna happen if people understand the scientific consensus on the issue of climate change and the fact that politicians and the corporations that contribute to climate change aren't doing enough about it, and are then having to resort to on-the-ground action and protest and disruption of transit as a way to get people to pay attention to the problem. Well, it's just logical that somebody's going to go on to shoot him. I feel like you're discounting the other options there of ways to resolve this issue, like, say, pressuring politicians to actually fix the issue of climate change, or attempt to, in more of a concrete way, like pressuring the corporations to fucking do something about it, since a lot of these emissions come from them as well. Like pressuring politicians to try to invest more government funds into researching green and renewable energies, building more nuclear perhaps, because that is the most efficient and cleanest energy source we have that we just don't use because it's spooky to people, even though the majority of meltdowns happen because of human error and not because of the actual tech, and a lot of that human error can be fixed. So there are so many other options that would stop the blocking of traffic by protesters for this issue that wouldn't be just getting out of your car and stone cold killing them because you're tired of it or whatever that means. But anyway, we're on a tangent. Regardless, bro is calling for violence. He won't outwardly say it with his chest, but he'll come so close as to, you don't even need to beat around the bush. He's just calling for violence here. That's my opinion. It's a fair, logical assessment to make. And that's the difficulty, that's the danger of being a public figure. Every single public figure has to worry about how their words are going to be interpreted, especially if you're talking about political issues. The thing is, there is such a large number of right-wingers who commit these attacks, who end up going on to have internet histories full of right-wing commentators online, or who even directly incite them, that it's not shocking anymore. It's not at the point where this attack happens and you speculate on, were they potentially motivated by something they read or watched online? It's more so, we're at the point where an attack like this happens and you're trying to guess which specific commentator that person listened to, right? The game has shifted in that instance.
My attitude on all this is, I don't believe it. Don't know, don't care. I just don't believe it.
The reason why is because he's scared. He is afraid. He doesn't want to show it, because he's a coward, but he's afraid. This is happening too often, and Tim Pool doesn't like it. But he understands, I believe, that this could be the potential consequence of such commentary, of such vitriolic commentary, especially when it comes to his commentary on queer people, like these two tweets. And these aren't the only ones. It's an inconvenient truth that he's hiding from, which is why he's just going, na boo-boo, I don't hear it. I'm going to put my head in the sand and pretend I do not see it. Because that's easier than owning up to the fact that this is likely to be a problem that you could fix as Tim Pool, but then you might start losing money because you wouldn't be able to peddle a lot of this shit that gets a lot of clicks, that gets a lot of views and ad revenue. Or maybe he's genuinely interested in these things happening and, he derives some kind of sick pleasure from it. Who knows? But what we do know is that he has to have some level of understanding of the potential for this happening, given how many times he's being cited in or being seen in the search history and the watch history of a variety of these violent right-wing attackers, that he now has to try to hide from that and ignore that inconvenient truth. So he just doesn't believe it, We just don't believe it, man.
This guy, it's so convenient that all of a sudden he's coming out and claiming Glenn Beck and James Lindsay, me and many others, were inspirational, or that's what he was listening to. It's absurd nonsense. It's a meaningless thing.
If you look at the historical context, it is not absurd nonsense. It's actually quite likely.
To these stories because they're trying to drum up traffic by including our names in it and things like this. Because the reality is, each and every one of us have quite literally said.
So he's saying no, the media is only saying that the attacker, David depape, was inspired by, or he watched, Tim Pool, Glenn Beck, James Lindsay, whatever, because they want clicks on their articles. No, that's not why it is, dumbass. It's because that's what David depape said on trial, on the stand, to a federal judge and federal courtroom, that he was then convicted of those federal charges. This was in his testimony. So unless you're saying he was lying under oath, it is not simply the media blaming Tim Pool, James Lindsay, and Glenn Beck. It's just the media reporting on the dude's testimony. Who cited you? You don't like that because you do not want to be seen at fault in any of it, because then you have to grapple with if you're okay with it. And if you haven't come to the conclusion that you are, you might have to change something about how you do your program or do your commentary, and then you worry that might lose you money. Or you might, face legal repercussion, which seems a lot less likely, even though I think there would be a good case for it. But it has to be one of those options. Like, you can't just blame the media here because it's his own words. Once again, if he was going to lie on the stand, why would he make up a lie that is a worse lie than the conspiracy theories you've literally cited in your own video not even a minute ago about David DePape not being there to kidnap Nancy Pelosi like he testified he was in this trial, but rather he was there to sell Paul Pelosi drugs? Doesn't make sense, brother. It does not make any sense. Doesn't make a lick of sense. Like, he would literally have made the lie, oh, yeah, I was there as, Paul Pelosi's drug dealer. Because then at that point, you would get in trouble for, drug trafficking or of, selling drugs or drug use or whatever. You wouldn't be there for breaking and entering and assault and attempted kidnapping, right? Those are worse charges. So why is he lying about things that would give him worse charges if convicted, rather than lying about stuff that people like Tim Pool and the media are already saying about what he was doing in order to play defense for him? He might just be incredibly stupid. Who knows? But if he's listening to Tim Pool, then of course he is.
The things this guy does or did or is accused of doing is the opposite of victory. So it's just, I find it fascinating.
The opposite of victory. But, we're just going to vaguely gesture at the only option being violence here. In this instance, in the specific instance of queer people, because he doesn't think legislators are going to do anything about it.
That this is the narrative that's emerging.
By the way, the reason why legislators aren't going to do anything about it is because the conspiracy theory that queer people are groomers is made up. They can't actually do anything about it because it is made up. And therefore, they have a justification that cannot be defeated because it's fucking fantasy. It's an easy argument to win because it doesn't actually happen in reality. You're basing all of this on a hypothetical. That isn't true.
A year later in testimony, because once again, James Lindsay's core point is your reaction is their goal. And so if you have a guy like him or me who are like, violence is the opposite of success, engaging in
man, by the way, civil war's happening. Civil war's gonna happen, guys. The left is just provoking the right into doing a civil war. Civil wars. If you're saying all that, like Tim Pool is constantly, because it gets him a lot of clicks, that's totally a guy, a person like that definitely abhors violence, condemns it at any chance, and says it's the opposite of what he actually stands for. Or, who posts tweets like this. Come on now.
Violent action is costing us.
Get serious.
And the fact is we are winning. Well, hold on. Why would someone...
Winning at what, by the way? Who's we? But who's winning? I thought Tim Pool said he was a milquetoast centrist, a milquetoast fence sitter. But he's saying we are winning in the same breath as he's talking about James Lindsay, who is very obviously a right-winger. So he's essentially just admitted to being right-wing, which isn't necessary, obviously, because everybody knew that already. And the only people stupid enough to think he's actually a centrist are right-wingers. In a lot of cases, they understand that he isn't actually a centrist. It's just convenient for him to pose as one so that he has more legitimacy for his fucking claims. He just admits he's on the right. That's cool. I'll take that. Finally, a little bit of honesty from Tim Pool.
Who listens to these podcasts actually go out and do something like this. Doesn't seem to make sense. Now, the simple answer, of course, Occam's razor would suggest this guy's nuts.
Well, that's certainly true. But he was also watching other people who are nuts, like Tim Pool and Glenn Beck and James Lindsay. So anyway, we don't need to see any more of that for that specific segment. But I do want to talk about how there's been so many right-wingers who have gone on to do violent, hateful acts. Like the dude who drove 3 miles out of his way to go to a predominantly black neighborhood and one of the most popular grocery stores in the area that a lot of black people went to so that he could do a racially motivated mass murder in that grocery store. And they claim that's not about racism. Certainly that dude wasn't listening to a variety of people online talking about how, these black people, they're a problem somehow, and, they're gonna take your women, and, they're a threat to your masculinity because they're just so much more masculine than white people, and, they're taking your jobs. Certainly that kind of shit wasn't in some way influential to that guy. Definitely not. But we also have more historic instances of a case that I've talked about in the past of Bill O'Reilly, who at the time had the most popular news program on cable news, on Fox News, and he was, very anti-abortion, pro-life as it were, or pro-forced birth. There was a person who just happened to work in reproductive health care and happened to, oversee abortions, Dr. George Tiller. And Bill O'Reilly said over and over and over again on his show that he was a baby killer. So much so that he had a nickname for him, Tiller the Baby Killer. And then, after that most popular cable news show does this over and over, eventually, in 2009, somebody goes out and kills the guy. Also, his clinic was firebombed. Right-wingers have been harassing and attacking Planned Parenthoods and a variety of other clinics that may or may not provide abortions for a long time. This is back in 2009. It is now the year of our Lord, current year 2023. Almost 2024. And it's still happening. We've also got this USA Today article that was posted on November 2nd, 2023, when libs of TikTok tweets, threats increasingly follow. We've talked about this on the channel before, of course, but Brookings, South Dakota, University LGBTQ+ group is hit with a flood of hate mail culminating in a bomb threat that terrifies students. San Lorenzo, California, a drag queen story hour is one of several pride events across the country stormed by suspected members of the extremist street gang, the Proud Boys. The men shout homophobic slurs and threats, and a performer hides in a back room waiting for police to arrive. I believe we covered that one. Philadelphia, Boston, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., Akron, Ohio. Threats hit hospitals and medical clinics, and some temporarily evacuate their patients while law enforcement assesses the danger. Then comes summer and fall 2023, at least 24 public schools and libraries start receiving bomb threats. In California, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin, they cancel classes and evacuate students. These cases and many more share a common link. The victim of each threat had also been targeted in the days before by the enormously popular conservative social media channel Libs of TikTok. In almost every case, the perpetrator of the threat is unknown, and Chaya Raichik, the far-right influencer who runs Libs of TikTok, says she opposes violence, and that because there have been almost no arrests, there's no proof the threats come from her followers. But whoever is making the threats, the posts show a clear pattern. USA Today has confirmed dozens of bomb threats, death threats, and other harassment after Libs of TikTok's post since February 2022. Based on exclusive new research from the progressive analysis group Media Matters for America, which currently is making a fool out of Elon Musk for exposing him for his anti-Semitism. Numerous news reports have covered individual threats, noting the target had also been mentioned by Libs of TikTok, but the new analysis of years of tweets, including archives of many Raichik has since deleted, shows the pattern is more extensive and pervasive than has been previously known, and that threats specifically against schools have ratcheted up significantly in the past 2 months. Media Matters used searches of published news reports to help identify more than 30 possible threat incidents. USA Today verified bomb, death, and other threats in more than 24 cases. The research most likely undercounts the total number of cases. Other threats may never be reported to police or the media, and some threats are reluctant to publicize their plight for fear of drawing even more harassment. As Libs of TikTok's reach has expanded, the account now has more than 2.6 million followers on X, formerly known as Twitter. So too has the frequency and ferocity of the threats that followed Raichik's posts. Hospitals have been evacuated, schools and libraries have cleared classrooms and canceled lessons while police officers search for bombs. Bookstores, pride parades, cafes, even a dog rescue center have had to lock down for fear of reprisals and violence. Quote, "We can only insulate ourselves from what's happening on social media for so long," said Ari Drennan, LGBTQ+ program director for Media Matters. Quote, "In a country where so many people have the ability to take things into their own hands, that's a very real worry. With the fact that there are more guns than there are people in the United States of America. And in many places, it's very easy to acquire a firearm. And in many cases, Republicans, conservatives are fighting to make it easier to, obtain a firearm legally. Much less a variety of other things we'll get into. So, this is not unique to Tim Pool, James Lindsay, Glenn Beck, Ben Shapiro, Bill O'Reilly, Tucker Carlson. It's not unique to these people, Libs of TikTok. It just happens to be a trend. And it happens to trend along a variety of right-wing commentators. Matt Walsh as well, true. And if you don't believe me, we actually have statistics here. The FBI, tabulates a variety of violent extremist events, has their own stats. The ADL has put together some. Now, I am, unfortunately, citing the ADL here, mostly because they have the better graphics. And I know you lizard-brained, video game-playing transgenders in my audience don't have a long attention span, so should you even still be watching this video, here's a nice graph for you to look at. But there is other data not, sourced by the ADL that you could look at, like from the Southern Poverty Law Center or literal FBI statistics, right? Oh, and by the way, I am remiss to, cite the ADL mostly because they are a Zionist outlet that has been absolutely dreadful in their coverage of Israel's ongoing genocide against the Palestinians, which is why, in this instance, they don't include Islamist extremism in right-wing extremism, even though the grand majority of Muslims who end up being involved in domestic extremism are right-wing. There's no reason to separate them, but the ADL is not a big fan of Muslims, so they separate them to make a point. Anyway, so I don't really like the ADL. I'm not the biggest fan because of that, but the data is still decent. Domestic extremist-related killings in the U.S. by perpetrator affiliation 2013 to 2022. You got 444 total deaths. That's not even current year we're adding in here. Right-wing extremists are responsible for the great majority of extremist-related murders over the last 10 years, brother, the last decade. Right-wing extremism, all movements, 75%, should actually be 95% if you're saying all movements, but adding domestic Islamist extremism as another option, that's still right-wing in the overwhelming majority of cases. So it's actually 95%. Left-wing extremism, including anarchists and black nationalists, 4%. Other/miscellaneous extremism, 1%, right? And right-wing extremist-related killings in the U.S. by perpetrator affiliation 2013-2022, nearly 3 out of 4 killings committed by right-wing extremists in the U.S. were committed by white supremacists. So of 335 total deaths, white supremacy was 73% of them. Anti-government extremism was 17% of them. Toxic masculinity extremism, like manosphere shit, incel shit, 5%. Anti-abortion and other right-wing extremism, 4%. The overwhelming statistical body of evidence that we have points to right-wingers being the grand majority of extremist-related killings in the United States. Given this information, it is factual that right-wing extremists are the greatest domestic terror threat in the United States. Not Muslims, not immigrants from Mexico, not black people. It's right-wing extremists. Yeah, take it up with the FBI if you don't like me saying it. And, some right-wingers would like to, mostly because the FBI is not the kindest to Donald Trump, their daddy. In other instances, the alphabet agencies have never been kind to leftists and have put out a variety of fucking intelligence ops to try to fuck over leftist organizing and all this kind of shit, COINTELPRO, etc., which has been proven to be real. If anybody has a reason to distrust the FBI, it would be people on the left, or the CIA, it would be people on the left. But, it's very clearly right-wing extremists who are the grand majority. So whenever one of these things happens, the probability of it being a right-winger and it being motivated by their right-wing views, or that person having listened to a variety of right-wing commentators, is very high. That's a high probability, man. To the point where, like I say, it's not really like, oh, this violent event happens, and you speculate, oh, was it a right-winger who did it? It's to the point where a violent event happens, and you're like, okay, well, which right-wing commentator was that person who did that violent event listening to or reading from? Like, we've already moved past the was it a right-winger part because it almost always is. Now, I, of course, do support some regulations on the ownership of guns. I am a fan of firearms. I go shooting a fair amount. And even I think that they should be harder to obtain. The laws that I support, that studies have shown would seem to be helpful, would be red flag laws, specifically targeting people who have a history of domestic violence. Studies have shown 60% of mass incidents of gun violence have been perpetrated by people with a history of domestic violence. So if you make it so that people who have a history of domestic violence have a harder time getting a firearm, the chances of those happening goes down. And because I'm a person of sense, I don't want to see people getting killed, so seems like a good idea to me. Also, wait times for gun purchases. If you make it so that people have to wait a week, 2 weeks before they receive their gun from when they bought it, and they don't just walk out of the store, out of the Walmart with it, crimes of passion end up being less likely because they're going to have to take that week or 2 weeks to think about if they really want to do this violent act that they're getting this gun for. There are a variety of different things you can do that still allow for lawful gun owners to exist, and that isn't just doing gun grabs, taking away your guns, brother. But the right wing doesn't support them. So then they go on to talk about, oh, well, what about mental health? It's mental health. It's mental health. It's mental health. It's not a gun issue. It's a mental health issue. And I don't directly, on its face, disagree with the fact that mental health is a problem in this country, generally speaking. There are so many people who would benefit from it who cannot obtain it. And it does certainly, in order to go out and do a violent act, you have to be mentally messed up in some way. Having mental health services in place could help people not get to such a point where they're going to do that kind of thing. Seems like a good idea to me to expand access to mental health care. But Republicans consistently vote against it. This is from 2022. 205 Republicans vote against a bill to expand school mental health services. This would be, of course, an attempt to stop school shootings, because the killing of innocent children, not great. Not a big fan on this show, frankly. I don't know if Tim Pool agrees. At this point, I'm not really sure. But for me, I know for sure, not a big fan of innocent children generally, getting killed in school, where they should be very safe, if not one of the safest places they can be. Republicans have spent months scapegoating mental health issues as a catch-all for problems like mass shootings, but they vote against its expansion every single time. So they're only citing it as a way to deflect from common sense gun regulations that would actually be beneficial. Reason being, they want the gun manufacturers to be able to make more money, and gun sellers to be able to make more money. And it's red meat for the base. Democrats are no angel on this either. Republicans are just a lot worse. All of this is to say that the right wing doesn't seem to want people to get access to mental health care. They seem to acknowledge that mental health is a problem, because anytime a mass shooting happens, they're like, no, it's not a gun issue, it's a mental health issue. But then they go on to vote against it and block any attempts of actually enfranchising more people into a mental health program. And they also often go up against Adderall or SSRI antidepressants and stuff like that, and talk about how they're actually poison, or they're useless, or it's placebo for big pharma to make more money, or whatever. So it seems like at every single possible turn, right-wingers just don't want people to be mentally well. Because why else would they stop all of these things from happening that might increase the likelihood of people being mentally well and getting the help that they need? You could look to a variety of other countries who have easier access for their populace to mental health care programs, and you'll find out that these things happen less. And of course, a lot of those countries often have stricter laws against guns. Some I would even disagree with. But you can see that it works. But they stand against it almost every time. So if we take all of this into account, if we look at the fact that the grand majority, 95% of domestic extremist-related killings in the United States are committed by right-wing extremists over the last 10 years, you mix that with the fact that so many of these violent right-wing perpetrators end up having a lot of these right-wing commentators in their internet histories, or directly cite them in federal testimony, like David depape, and other, attackers and perpetrators who have directly cited people. Well, then you couple that with the fact that right-wingers want to do nothing about the exponential amount of gun crime and gun violence that we see in this country, the rate of mass shootings, in terms of any kind of common sense gun regulation. And they stand in the way of the actual fix for the problem, mental health care. Even like when they say that that's the solution, they still vote against it anyway. It seems like they're okay with this happening, because they're not doing anything to make it not happen. And they keep doing a lot of things that make it worse, right? Because not only will right-wingers stand in the way of common sense gun regulations like red flag laws and wait time for gun purchases, but they'll also often deregulate gun regulations, get rid of them, make it easier to obtain a gun. When the whole point of making it more difficult to attain a gun, not impossible, but more difficult, and impossible for the people who shouldn't have them, like people with a history of domestic violence who might use it on their partner or their family members and others, because a lot of these mass incidents tend to start with the killing of their close family members, and then they go out and kill random civilian strangers. If they end up supporting a variety of deregulation that makes guns easier to access, then it kind of seems like they either don't care or are okay with it, with the preponderance of right-wing domestic extremist killings. I don't know what other possible logical conclusion you could draw. Either they don't care about it, or they like it. Now, I could tell you, I think they like it. A lot of them, I think, genuinely do enjoy it, because it gives them a story to talk about. It lets them talk about their favorite issues, like gun rights, which is good for clicks, it's good for votes as well, protecting the gun rights, etc., etc. But I also think they like it because, one, the cruelty is the point. For a lot of these people, they just delight in the suffering of others. But they also enjoy the destabilization to American life that it brings, that right-wing domestic terror attacks bring. Why else would right-wing militias in the United States attack power substations so frequently, and even have it in their manuals that they use in their own organizations, ways to do it, instructions for how to attack said power substations to destabilize an area? They seem to like it. Because the more these attacks happen, the more that they can give money to the police, right? That's one of the solutions that they've thought up that don't seem to work, is, we'll put more police resource officers in schools, and that'll stop the shootings, even though Parkland had one, and it didn't. oh, well, we'll have more police so that there will be more people to neutralize the threat. Even though one of the best case police responses we've ever seen happened in a recent school shooting. I forget which one it was. Was it the Covenant one? They actually got there really quickly. But at the time that they got there, children had already died. Because the thing is, unless you see the perpetrator with the gun before they start shooting, and you're able to stop them from using it before they start shooting, the way that you're going to know there is a student with a gun who might have intent to use it on people in the school, the alarm bell for that is children dying or a teacher dying, right? That's how you find out. So in order to stop the death, more police officers is not the only solution there. And especially like we saw, which school shooting was it? There are so many in the United States because right-wingers support so many things that make the problem worse. It was in Texas somewhere? Uvalde, thank you. There were like so many cops there, but they were scared of the fact that the perpetrator who was shooting kids had an AR-15, so they just loitered in the fucking halls for 30 minutes. I forget how long it was, but it was an absurd amount of time because nobody wants to work anymore, apparently. So like even having a whole bunch of cops there doesn't seem to help the problem. But it's a way to give the police more money, more toys, more surplus military hardware that they can use to oppress protesters, essentially, and harass the undesirables in this country. So say the Republicans, conservatives, brown people, black people, queer people, because that's what it ends up doing. The police are a fairly right-wing organization in this country, judging by their voting trends. And you can get more sales for gun manufacturers, because what if, our other solution, not expanding mental health services and access because, they vote against that, not common sense gun regulations like the ones I've described that have been seen to be effective, not any of that shit, but what if we armed every teacher and gave them training so that they could act as the thin chalk line between absolute anarchy in the classroom so they can neutralize one of their own students who is trying to kill a bunch of children, a bunch of their peers. Because that makes a lot of sense. The entire reason they support that, by the way, is because it allows for gun manufacturers to make and sell more guns. Because if you mandate that every teacher has to be trained with and have a firearm in a school, well then suddenly a bunch of schools have to be paying, or a bunch of taxpayer dollars has to go to the manufacture and purchase of these weapons. It's just a win for gun manufacturers, and it doesn't actually help the problem, because once again, it is the same problem with police. How does a teacher then, in that instance, who has the firearm and is trained with its use, neutralize the threat before any other death happens? They're going to have to see the child with the gun before they use it, and then essentially kill that child who has the gun before the child has a chance to fire back at them, who they know have a firearm, or kill other students. And if that is not possible, which it so frequently isn't, the alarm bell then is the death of children so that all of the other teachers can get their fucking glizzies out and hunt down this kid before the police arrive to stop so much needless killing. And that's assuming that the teachers who are trained in the use of these firearms will be able to, one, do it in an actual real situation and not just training, unless they're putting them in fucking Metal Gear Solid VR training. The first time they ever have to use it in practice is going to be one of these instances. Who knows how they're going to react mentally, physically? Who knows how their aim might differ because of those influences, because of the mental anguish that a person probably incurs for having to kill one of their own students. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. And at that point, the right-wing solution is literally starting with the death of children as the alarm bell, or the death of a teacher at the best case scenario, because, we put the lives of children ahead of the lives of adults before any kind of, solution gets put into practice, because they oppose everything else. You mean how likely they'll end up missing their target and hitting a child? Yeah, it's also possible that even a police officer might not take a shot if there is a crowd of people, of innocent people behind the perpetrator. The police might not try to take a shot because they might either miss and hit an innocent civilian behind the perpetrator, and that's not a good thing. They're trying to avoid that usually. So it's often the case that they're not trying to do that. It's just not a viable solution, and it shouldn't be taken as one on its face. Also, assuming that the kid will be acting alone and won't be creative enough to circumvent the safety measures they know well themselves because they too have participated in the school shooting drills, yeah. Like, there are so many actual ways to stop or to mitigate the possibility of these things happening, and Republicans just happen to stand in the way every single time. So I've been at the point where I think they either don't care or are okay with it. And in fact, some may enjoy it. Those are the options we have left. That's not up to me. Right-wingers could prove me wrong, Republicans could prove me wrong, but they just keep proving me right. Anyway, Tim Pool's a fucking joke. Literally just lying here because he is scared of being implicated in a variety of these things because of the results of his actions and the logical consequences thereof. And we may never see him without the beanie again. He will probably wear the beanie when he, passes away of old age, hopefully, like we all hope to, surrounded by loved ones. In his open casket, he will likely still be wearing the beanie. Anyway, these lighthearted, funny, lame meme comments brought to you by, we just talked about a lot of serious shit, and I want to have you leave this segment with at least a little bit of whimsy in your heart. Anyway, be good, be safe, and take it easy.